Perhaps you can, but then you have to have an understanding of the world that relies upon your subscribing to science and to a scientific way of thinking. Perhaps then one is able to record facts and put them into a framework that is coherent and that is consistent with numerous observations. We've been talking about European wars, but I want to make the point about wars that have been waged on this subcontinent, because those are of the greatest interest to us. Pakistan and India have gone to war in 1948, 1965, 1971, and then in Kargil in 1999. And yet there's a total difference. There are absolutely different narratives about that war. Is it possible that there can be one narrative about this? Is it possible that we could arrive at some set of facts that we could mutually agree upon? Let me tell you how different it is. In Pakistani schools, it is taught that all the wars that Pakistan has fought were purely defensive wars. That we were attacked in 1965, that we were attacked again in 1971. That is when India broke up Pakistan into two. But the 1965 war in particular, I think, is very interesting, because that is shown as a defensive war in which India attacked across the border and was just about to take over Lahore. And so Pakistan had no alternative but to fight back, and that it essentially won the war, but that the war was stopped by Ayub Khan, else we would have had a victory over India. Well, if you look at what the other people in the Pakistani establishment have to say, like Air Marshal Asghar Khan, they have a completely different narrative on this. They will tell you that, in fact, this was Operation Gibraltar. It was an attempt to cause the Kashmiris to rise up, and the sending of Pakistani commandos over there would be the catalyst for this. So here are two completely different ways of looking at the same historical situation inside Pakistan. So although we talk of how history has been recorded over the ages, but this is something that is contemporary. And if we cannot agree on the contemporary, then surely there is little chance of agreeing what has happened in the distant past.
On the other hand, I mean, to respond to that...
Can I just say that it's impossible to do current histories. Histories have to be written at least 50 years after. So when you're saying, you know, Pakistan-India wars, you can't get objective, neutral opinions now. You have to wait for that. 100 years from now, maybe, yes.
Well, I was going to come back with Chu
Yes,
Enlai's
it
famous
would be
quote
worse.
about this. Chu Enlai once said that he was asked whether the French Revolution was a success or not in 1789. They asked him, of course, about the 1960s, and he said it was far too early to tell. I think also, I mean, certainly when I went to university, we weren't allowed to study anything after about 1900 because they just said the papers weren't available. I mean, most governments have release dates on papers and documents that mean that you can't get them for at least 30 years, usually 50 or so on. But I'd like to come back to Professor Kazmi on this question. Can we write a current history?
Well, I think we can, but as Dr. Hudboy has mentioned the 1965 war, let me tell you, it's one of the most furious wars in history. Initially, both sides claimed victory. Subsequently, both sides admitted defeat. Mirza Aslam Beg, Chief of Army Staff here in Pakistan, Admiral Nandkarni in India, both admitted that their countries had fared very badly in the 1964-5 war. So you have a consensus, but we have a consensus that we can't do anything with. And yes, we can write. You see, it's also a question of knowing your signifier, because Dr. Hudboy mentioned Edward Hallett Carr, and he makes the basic point that every fact is not a historical fact. And instead of facts propping up interpretations, facts are like an empty potato sack that unless you put interpretations in it, the facts will not speak. So, well, all right, we are chauvinistic here, the Indians are chauvinistic there, and the Bangladeshis are also chauvinistic there, everybody is chauvinistic, but then it's possible because the records are there. And I think if an Australian or a French historian were to take over the records from both countries of the 1965 war, then yes, contemporary history would be possible. Why not? I would think so.
Dr. Kuro, if we don't write contemporary history now, are we not in some danger of actually losing the facts of what went on, especially with media like oral history, which has been very important, I think, is being done now quite well on partition, for instance?
Well, you can, obviously there's record. You have to have record of everything. I mean, as I said, even in the medieval period in India, the facts were recorded. Facts as they were known wherever they were recorded. The question is that you can't have a real assessment of the events until some time afterwards now for instance, the history of partition on both sides is just emotional and prejudiced. You can't read about any writer who has written about that nearer time with any degree of, this is really objective, because that's all on one side, and there's so much emotion involved in that you really can't have objective history at that time. So I think the children now growing up in Pakistan and India, they have a much more objective view of feeling about it. They want to know why. Why did this happen and that? And they're not overwhelmed by personal experience. So it's much, you can expect from them some objectivity and perhaps good writing, history writing, but you can't expect it from people who've gone through that experience. So I think it's good to record things. I'm sure it should be written about, but don't expect that to be objective history.
So should we not expect your book about your father to be objective history?
It's a record of facts.
I'd actually like to move to the audience for some questions now to get this debate going, if we may. Who wants to start off? We have one over here. Can we have the microphone over here, please? I'll come to you next.
It's been wonderful listening to everybody's views expressed in such an erudite manner. However, most of the panelists just confined themselves to the subcontinent. They just talked about mutilation of history in the context of the subcontinent. Now, what I would like to ask is this a purely phenomenon that's restricted to the subcontinent? What about the Americans? 63 years ago, when they dropped the atom bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, since then, American history books have been telling us that they did it for the sake of peace, which is a very sloppily contrived lie. Actually, the reasons why they did that was, firstly, they wanted to snatch world leadership from Britain through sheer balance of terror. Secondly, the Soviet Union was about to invade the Japanese Far East. And the Americans didn't want the Japanese to surrender to the Soviets. These were the reasons why. And if you will, what about the black hole of Calcutta? It is nothing but a figment of a very underdeveloped imagination. So is this phenomenon just confined to the subcontinent, or is it worldwide?
Pervez Hoodboy? Oh, of course, Professor Kazmi.
I think Masudur Rasin and Pervez Hoodboy, we gave examples to show that bias in history was not confined to the subcontinent. But since it affects us more directly, we started concentrating on that. And one thing more that you should see that Madeleine Albright, in her memo to the president-elect, she stated one of the reasons why there's so much conflict in the world is that nationalistic history books cause chauvinism to be nurtured in every country. So it's not that we are excluding, she mentioned Napoleon for and against, it consists only of French historians. German historians are not included in that. You have a number of such debates that, well, I mentioned A.J.P. Taylor and Trevor Roper, so it's not that we've been confined to the South Asian subcontinent. But yes, I'm saying there are misconceptions, and there are two types of misconceptions. One are deliberate misconceptions, and then there are other misconceptions because we haven't been able to channelize the chaotic mass of historical literature. So you can blame us for the first, please don't blame us for the second.
There was a question.
Just a quick addendum on that. There is another kind of history, and that is Marxist history, which is different from history written out of nationalistic motives. For example, the explanation given by Marxists for the First and the Second World Wars is that this was related to capitalism's need for exporting capital. In other words, imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, according to Lenin. Now, that's a different way of approaching history. It seeks to find objective reasons. It seeks to find the material reasons for what causes war, what causes development, and so forth. That, I think, is an entirely separate chapter, but a very interesting one.
Can I please go to this lady who had her hand up first in the purple shirt? I'm sorry, behind you, actually. It's just that she had her hand up at the beginning. Just 4 rows back. No, just behind this lady. Can you stand up, please? Thank you. I'll come to you next. I'm sorry, it's just... Yeah.
This question is it's based off what Dr. Hoodboy said about scientific approaches to history being the way to go about it. And as a student of history, I actually have serious reservations about approaching history from a scientific point of view. And a lot of us go towards history rather than political science not because we're studying the past as opposed to current affairs, it's because we seriously disagree with the methodology. So I just want to know, don't you think there's enough evidence that you can't necessarily get the most comprehensive understanding of historical events or, human experience through certain scientific methodologies?
Pervez Hoodboy, would you like to respond to that?
I didn't quite get the question.
Oh, could you repeat? Sorry, we need the microphone back.
The sound system is not very good over here.
Yeah, please
I'm
speak
just
as
saying,
clearly as possible.
What part did you not understand the whole question, or did you not hear the whole question? You didn't hear, okay. I'm saying the part you said that, scientific approaches to history, studying it from a scientific point of view will give us the most kind of clear answers or a better understanding of it. So I'm saying as a student of history, I have serious reservations about scientific approaches. That's why some of us move towards history rather than political science, because it's not because we're studying the past rather than current affairs, it's because we seriously disagree with the methodology and want to take a different approach to understanding human experience.
Well, one can take two very different points of view. One is that history can be codified into facts, that there is only one history. And you can take the other extreme, which is that that history has to be entirely individualized and personal, or perhaps based upon groups, that each group will look at history in a different way. Now, if it is true that no objective recording of history is possible, then that means we would be an utterly fragmented community not just of individuals in a nation, but of nations themselves. So there has to be, the truth has to lie somewhere in between. Yes, those filters of our mind, they do determine how we arrange the facts, but those arrangements cannot be too different. Otherwise, The extreme point of view would be that we wouldn't be able to agree upon anything at all.
Can I now move to the lady at the front who I just deprived of her question?
I have a general observation that while writing history, the historians are not always been biased about the events, but the group of people or a majority of people. Like women are missing from the history. And even there, where they have played some very constructive and very positive role, like history of culture or history of literature. And it is general phenomenon in the world. So any one of the speaker can answer on it.
Yes, Hamida?
Well, I think that's a very valid point. In fact, let's say, a conventional history is now being overturned, as it were, and narratives of women, of, let's say, Africa, of areas that have been marginalized so far, are now being looked at, and especially women's movements and so on have helped a lot. And I think this is the current trend, that the marginalized people are now being, recorded, and histories are being written for. Africans particularly, because of the slave trade, and Africans in America, in the U.S. and so on, are very much aware of this, and they live in a society where of course, history is very important, and important historians are writing it and so on. So they are aware that